Guys, welcome back to another video. So I know OP10 is fast approaching in the West, and since I live over here in Japan, I've already played through OP10 and we're in the middle of EBO2 at the moment. So I wanted to make a kind of guide video for OP10 Bonney and give you guys the key cards, kind of talking about the matchups, show you a matchup spread chart that I actually made, show you some winning lists and some lists that I've liked to play over the time of OP10, and just give you like kind of a nice fundamental breakdown of what I consider to be kind of like the things to look out for, the things to consider when building decks for Bonney and OP10, and just give you like a little crash course if that's something you're interested in. I will try and make other like gameplay and more specific videos later, but I thought it'd be good to just start off with a video like this so that you can go from just, from scratch. You can build some Bonney lists for OP10 and you can see what it was kind of like for us over here in the East and like kind of the decks that we were playing. But without any further ado, let's just jump in and let's get started. Alright, I'm going to try and keep this as short and concise as possible, but I do want to get as much useful information in as I can at the same time. So I'll break down what the topics are going to be, and I'll have everything in the chapters in the video, so you can skip around, just look at whatever you want. That's all good. Hopefully that helps you guys. But these are the main topics. We're going to talk about like the new cards that were introduced for green that Bonney is like has been using, or other cards to consider using, even if not a lot of people have been using them. And then talking about like the key cards for the meta. So like your top end cards like 5-cost Bonney and 6-cost Hawkins, what matchups they're good into and like what they can be useful for, because I don't want to just like showing somebody a list but not explaining like what the actual uses for some of the key cards are. I think it can be a little bit of a disservice, because if you want to help people get better and like be able to understand like what and why they should be using some of the cards in their deck, I think it's really important to consider like what they're actually there for. So I want to try and show you guys what the actual like the key cards are actually strong into, so that you can take a look at your local meta or however big the meta is that you're going to be approaching and try and build and tech correctly for that meta that you're going to be facing. The other thing is we'll look at an OP10 matchup spread chart. This is something that I made personally, but taking into account like a lot of other Bonney players' opinions and stuff like that. It is biased, but I mean every matchup spread chart is. Then I'll show you guys some deck list examples, some winning lists that we had over here in Japan, a few lists, one list that I enjoyed playing and had some pretty good results with, and then we'll finish it off with some final thoughts and advice for anyone who wants to play Bonney in OP10. This is a little bit of a beginner's guide, but I think even if you're a seasoned Bonney player, I think this will be helpful, because you can see kind of what was going on in the East and Japan for Bonney players and what we kind of like the variations and things we went through while tackling as the meta changed and everything. But that's it for the topics, so let's just jump in. Alright, so just to start things off, right, these are the new cards. Obviously the main ones, and what I think everyone's extremely hyped for to start using and playing in the West is going to be the new 3-cost Tashigi and 5-cost Smoker. Tashigi is essentially like a mini 8-cost Rosie in the form of a 2k counter. Really, really strong. This card, I think, it just instantly becomes a 4F staple in a lot of, if not almost every green deck moving forward, and just really, really helps with especially stuff like blue. This helps with the Dofi matchup. This makes like the Boa matchup like manageable. If you draw Tashigi, if you start off with a Tashigi in your hand and you like the rest of your draws and everything are decent, I think the Boa matchup becomes about a 50-50, which is crazy, and I don't think you could have ever said that before. 5-cost Smoker is a great card because it's essentially like another Cavendish that we can have on the field. Being able to restand one Dawn at any point during your turn because its activate main is extremely strong. It's not restricted to an on-play too, so it's even stronger against stuff like Teach, and of course it has that little word there, Banish. Having the pressure with the Banish is incredibly strong, plus it's a 7k, so this is another card that's really, really going to help out against stuff like Shanks. It's not as easily KO'd, and just getting a 7k body on your 5 Dawn curve while still being able to get a Dawn up is just kind of insane. And while it is counterless, the value that you get from it is very worth playing. Some people even run 4 copies. I think 2 to 3 is kind of the sweet spot for a lot of people, but we'll get into that later. These are some other cards that I don't necessarily think are really amazing or anything in Bonney, but I thought I'd just point them out. One is the Odyssey NL, because it's one of the only ways that we can get any kind of cycle. There's like Bardo blocker and a Nell, and kind of the killer blocker, There's only a few ways we can get any kind of card draw or cycle with green. So this is a decent card, but it's not going to be searchable, and you know, the having 2 or more rested characters when you're playing it already is kind of hard. Obviously, it's easier to meet with Lim because he comes out rested through leader effect. I've tried this card out a little bit. I don't think it's really that strong, just because it's hard to get the requirements met there. But you know, just something to consider. And then there's another one here, Radio Knife. This card is really cool. I like this card a lot, and I have tried this card out at 2 or 3 just a couple times throughout OP10 to see if it could help. I do think there are matchups in certain situations where it's really strong, but at the end of the day, it just never seemed worth it to, like, for the space that it's taking up to run. But being able to rest something with 6 or less, and also get the KO of a 5 or less is really strong. The trigger is okay too. All right, so let's talk about the key cards and what they're actually for, and I'll show you guys how many copies most decks actually run. Tashigi, I think, is just a 4 of. I think you just have to. It's the anti-removal dream card. This card is amazing. It really helps you out against, like I said, it helps out against blue. It's decent into black. If they have a 3-cost Brook on the board, things get kind of hard. Like Lucci, honestly, more than you might think, Lucci has an easier time removing this. Even Smoker, if they have a 3-cost Brook and also a 5-cost Tashigi, like 3-cost Brook on board and a 5-cost Tashigi in hand, it's not that hard for them to get rid of Tashigi and then the other, like, maybe 5 costs that you have on the board. But it's extremely strong, and in a lot of situations you're pressuring your opponent to where they're just gonna KO Tashigi, and whatever you played with Tashigi is gonna survive for that turn. So it's amazing. It's like 8-cost Rosie, and it has all the same benefits, but with also being a 2k counter. With the introduction of Tashigi and Smoker, it does make it a lot harder to run like a smooth and consistent double searcher build, which is why you see a lot of people switching to single searcher for OP10. We over here in the East, we started to switch towards the end of OP9 just because like the way our meta was. And I think that transitioned into OP10, and most people just stuck with it because it just makes it a little bit easier to like run enough counter, and then also run these like kind of unsearchable cards like Smoker, Tashigi, and 9-cost Shanks. But let's move on. 5-cost Smoker, like we said, great pressure with Banish, works as extra Cavendish for getting the Dawn back up, although it is another non-searchable counterless card, which makes it hard to run. Like, you're not going to run Smoker at 1, right? A lot of people end up running it at 2. I've run it at 2 to 3 in most of my builds. You want to run it at 3 just so that you see it. 4 can be a lot because if you get Smoker late game, it's kind of just like a brick that you really don't need and can be hard to play out of hand. But if you only play it at 2, sometimes you don't see it enough. So 2 to 3 is kind of the sweet spot. But some people elect not to run Smoker, which I think just depending on your build is fair. 5-cost Bonney. So to get into some actual, and like Smoker, you know, obviously really strong against yellow, really strong against Teach. Honestly, a good pressure card, even against stuff like Doflamingo. You can ignore their board if they don't have any rested characters and just get a banish off. And it's really hard for Doflamingo to get rid of. It is a 5-cost, so it's susceptible to stuff like Jozu and Gravity Blade, but that's where Tashigi can come in. 5-cost Bonney, you know, this has been a really cool tech card for Bonney for forever, right? And I love this card, and I've run it on and off, you know, for even in OP9 I ran it. It throws off Usopp's 7 Dawn turn curve, so they can't play Rebecca on 7 and get like the Rebecca Kyros Zoro or Rebecca Luffy Zoro kind of combo off. So that's a really strong card, really strong play to consider there. And then obviously it's strong against Dawn Curve reliant decks like Shanks, Enel, and BY. But I don't think there's enough room to run it at more than 2, so I think this is going to be 0 to 2 copies. Hawkins, I know a lot of people took Hawkins out for like OP9, and I think understandably so. I don't think he was a completely necessary card, but in OP10 and OP11 or EBO2, with like EBO2, like Enel is back, and I think there's even more use cases. But even in OP10, I think this is a strong card against Black, obviously, Usopp, Shanks, and Blackbeard. I think it's an underrated card in the Blackbeard matchup, and this card is really strong against Usopp because the one thing you don't want to do is give them a full value play. Like if you play something like, you know, if you have a Cavendish and a Tashigi on board, you're not safe against Usopp because they can play Kyros and Zoro at the same time. Zoro to KO Tashigi, and then Kyros to bounce back your 5-cost. So you not only just lost your entire board, Tashigi's gone, you lost a 2k from your hand for no reason, and then you got your 5-cost bounce back to you. So like you don't have a lot of strong plays that you can actually do from your like 4 to 7 Dawn turns as Bonney against Usopp. And this is where Hawkins comes in because he's a card that is hard. It's hard for Usopp to get rid of, and it just makes going for lethal for him even harder. But again, there's a space issue, so 0 to 2 copies. I ran him on and off in OP10, but I ended up running him at 1 to 2 for like the last couple of weeks, just because I really felt like he was strong, especially as Usopp kind of came more and more into the meta. So that's it for these 4. Let's look at the more of the top end cards. So these are boss monsters, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with all of these from OP9. Basically, it's just like you kind of have to scan the meta, see what's at the top, see what you need the top end for, and then like decide accordingly, right? So looking at ACOS Kid, this is a card that I think, you know, as long as Dofi is the best deck in format, it's probably a card that you just have to run in Bonney. It's our best defense against Dofi. It's still really strong against stuff like Ploofy and BY. I think people kind of underrate how strong this card is just against, you know, Ploofy and BY, especially with the single searcher build, because you're normally allowed, like, it's easier to run more counter. A lot of people run 11 to 12 2k counters throughout OP10 and EBO2. A lot of people run 8 chump blockers, 4 Rosies, 4 killers, or like your other chump blocker Supernova blocker, plus 11 to 12 2k counters. And when you go full like Fortress, you're like a very defensive and tons of counter. It's really hard for stuff like Ploofy to get over it. And even Green Purple Luffy in EBO2, even when they start teching stuff like Gamma Knife and other things like that, as long as you have another boss monster like Doflamingo to kind of back it up, I think it just still is kind of an unbeatable combo that is really, really strong. And it makes it hard not to run ACOS Kid. I have done stints of not running ACOS Kid in OP10, and it really depends on the meta, and I hope there's a day where we don't have to run ACOS Kid in Bonney, because sometimes I like to just switch it up, you know. But I'm just going to be completely honest, I think it's a card that you need to run in your deck, and I would do 3 to 4 copies depending on the meta. If you run 4, you're just guaranteed to see it against stuff like Dofi, so some people prefer that. Let's move on to Shanks. Obviously still our best answer to Red Shanks, the leader. The 11k stat line is amazing as a finisher, and it's decent against just a lot of the OP10 leaders. Like, it's really good against Usopp in certain situations because you get their Kyros or something off the board. It's strong against Yellow Kid because late game they're not able to restand everything, obviously, or if they have a 10 cost ace on the board, if you need to KO that and then have something that can swing over their 9k blocker that is a 7 cost Law or 8 cost Kid at the end game is really strong. But I do think it's very meta dependent, and it's going to be 0 to 4 copies for me. I ran him at 3 to 4 copies throughout most of OP10 just because Shanks came like up and down a lot, and it's just a good card. Like, I mean, even in worst case scenario, it becomes a strong card that you can play and teach if you have the time and like the defenses to do so. Moving on to Hody, it's crucial against decks like Usopp and Yellow Kid. You need it to go for game. Hody kind of like really throws off Usopp's game plan because not only do they not get to block with the blocker that they have, like a Frankie or something, since they can't block, they don't get the leader effect draw, and they also don't get something like the Frankie effect to pull back a Leo or something, rest their stage, and then draw, you know, what could be 2k counters. So you just like rip away all that value, and I think that is just kind of insane. It's really good value for us to have against them. Not like Usopp's not like the main deck to worry about, but it's really strong against stuff like Yellow Kid. It's obviously just our finisher for like so many games. Hody's my favorite card in the game. I'm sure you guys have heard me say that, but it's versatile in basically every single matchup and necessary for Teach. I think you need to run 4 just partly because of like Teach, Usopp, and then just how good it is in general. But you can do 3. Some people run 3. I've ran it at 3 before in certain times, like at a 3-on-3 tournament and stuff. But outside of like literally a few times, I ran him at 4. 10 cost Dofi. So a lot of people took 10 cost Dofi out of their deck in OP10 and started reintroducing him more in EBO2 because of decks like Green Purple Luffy coming on the rise. But I've always been a fan of 10 cost Dofi, even in OP10. And without him, a lot of people just ran like Kid, Shanks, Hody at like 3 to 4 of each, which consistency wise is really, really nice. But I have a feeling that Enel might kind of come back a little bit sooner for the West, just because they can see how strong he is in EBO2. Dofi is another card that really helps out against Enel. He helps out in just like some of those matchups where You know, like sometimes if you get an ACOS kid on the board against Dofi or Ploofy, like yes, you survive a turn, but you don't survive the second turn. And a card like Dofi just ensures that you survive that turn. It does require more setup with things like Cavendish and Smoker if you want to use Kid and them together. But with cards like 5-cost Smoker, playing a 10-cost Dofi down and then restanding the Dawn with Smoker is still, it's an amazing combo and really, really strong. So if you do prefer to run Smoker, you can play 10-cost Dofi more safely, in my opinion. It's not 100% necessary though, so if there is one top end that you would consider maybe getting rid of, I think, you know, Shanks or Dofi, just depending on the meta. But you know, it's still really strong against Dofi, Ploofy, BY. Honestly, it's strong against Shanks. But here's the thing. And this is why I wanted to make a point of this. It's really weak against Teach. This is the worst top end against Teach, just because not only is it 10 Dawn, and like at least Shanks is 9 Dawn for 11k, right? You have to leave one up for leader. The thing is against Teach, if you play 10 cost Dofi and you don't have the Dawn, even if you think like, oh, it doesn't matter, they're gonna play the 10 cost, they don't always have the 10 cost. So like having the threat of your 1 Dawn, the leader effect being online until they play that 10 cost is really, really strong. And it just ends up, you just lose so much value if you use all 10 Dawn just to get a 10k body on the board. Like you have to put at least 2 Dawn on him to even swing over like a 12k 10 cost Teach blocker. So because of that, I think it's very, very meta dependent. And if there's a lot of Teach, I would consider taking him out, or at least only just running him at 3. I wouldn't run him at 4 if you have a lot of Teach in your meta. I just don't think it really makes sense. But I think 3 is fine if you still have some of your other stuff. Like if you have the 4 Hodies, if you have the techs you need for Teach, I think you can run them at 3. All right, and lastly, these are just some like tech cards and some things to think about. Luna, I don't really recommend this for OP10, but it's a tech card that Bonney has used in the past. It's good against stuff like Dofi and Ploofy, and it will be very useful against stuff like GP, Luffy, and EBO2. Obviously, like I'm saying here, it becomes stronger in EBO2, but I wouldn't really worry about it. Straw Sword, I love this card. It's my favorite event in the game. Hodie and Straw Sword just make me a happy boy. The best tech card to fight against Teach, and strong against things like Usopp and Yellow Kid. Just get resting their you know 7-cost law blocker that became a blocker for 2 Dawn can just win you the game sometimes. Then we got the you know, the Billionfold event card there. This is actually a more recent tech that I've seen people play in like OP10 and EBO2, and one that I was really skeptical of at first, but it kind of makes sense because it's a great tech card against Teach and just in a pinch sometimes, because I do think there are times when you can, if you have a Smoker on the board, you can leave up 2 Dawn because you're leaving up the one that you normally would and you get like another one, or Cavendish obviously. But this is a good card against Teach because if they play their 10-cost Teach, your leader effect is no longer online. So if you left a Dawn up, which you're normally trying to do no matter what, you don't lose value from that. Because you've probably used up most of your other Dawn, you know, and you have 8 or more rested cards in most cases, right? This is the demerit of this card for sure, but just having a 1-cost 4k counter that can kind of save you sometimes is really, really strong. I think you can, in a pinch, you know, you use it to protect your life, or if they're going for game, or to protect your characters on the board, which is something that happens a lot where they're just going to use their freaking 12, 13k Burgess to swing over your like ACOS kid or you know, Hodie or whatever you have on the board. This can get you out of jail sometimes, and it just makes that 1 Dawn you left up not useless. And this is something I've been kind of turned on to recently, and I actually think it's really cool, and I want to do more testing with it. And then lastly, we got 8-cost Rosie and 9-cost Zoro, 2 of my favorite cards here. But just, it's always the card that it's like you put in your deck and then you're like, oh, I have to cut something, and it's like, oh, it's gonna be one of these. I do think Rosie is a lot stronger in EBO2 for whatever reason, just like the matchups and like getting the extra board advantage, and having another AK beater is just really, really strong, especially with like, you know, green purple Luffy being more present. Playing out a carrot and locking something, or playing out Smoker. Playing Smoker off of 8-cost Rosie is like one of the best feelings in the game, and I love it so much. I definitely tried out Rosie a little bit in OP10. I was running like a full Don Quixote build with no ACOS kid for a little while, just testing it out. And just comboing like ACOS Rosie, Smoker, and 10-cost Dofi was just insanely strong. It was just a little bit hard to consistently beat Dofi, so that's why I stopped running that. 9-cost Zoro obviously is good against Teach and can win you certain games if you safely get him on the board, but I do think he's a little bit of a liability, and unless Teach is just really present in the meta, I don't know if he's actually worth it. I almost prefer just running Straw Sword at 1 to 2 copies and then going in with a game plan of trying to get them down to 1 to 0 life as soon as possible, and then just using Straw Sword to go for game. But you know, that's easier said than done sometimes, and if you're running 3 Zoro in your deck, the odds of you getting 1 to 2 down against Teach are pretty high. But yeah, it's extremely, this is super meta dependent. And obviously Rosie for black, Usopp, and board presence. That's the other thing. Rosie's really good against Usopp, if you want to get that down, because you know, obviously if they really want to, they can bounce like back your 5 cost, but at least Rosie's gonna stick. And if you have a Tashigi on the field already, it's really strong. And then, you know, Zoro for Teach, and can still be good against like BY, and obviously really good in the mirror. But those are the main key cards for OP10 and what they're useful for. I hope that was helpful. I know this is like a little bit longer section, but I really wanted to give like my reasoning behind why the cards are being used and give you an idea of like what to consider when you're building your own Bonney deck. All right, and this is the OP10 Bonney matchup spread that I made. And I think the way I'm going to kind of do this is to make sure this just doesn't go on for too long. I'll just quickly go over like the builds. You can see I have like a general build, a fortress build, like Don Quixote, double searcher, like anti-KO, like strong against black kind of build, and then a mixed or miscellaneous kind of build. I'm going to go over the general build line here, but feel free to like pause the video. I'm gonna try and post this on my Twitter and stuff too if you want to see and like download it for yourself or whatever. Again, these are just my opinions, this is biased, but I think this is a pretty fair assessment overall. So we'll just look at the general build, because that's like kind of assuming you're doing an all-rounder approach. You maybe have 3 to 4 ofs for all of your top end. You may not even run Dofi, the 10-cost Dofi, but you've got Kid, Shanks, and Hody for sure. You're probably running a mix of most of them. And a lot of these matchups are kind of build dependent, so that does kind of skew things. And I tried to give a simple yet very informative and like all-encompassing kind of overview of like what your matchups look like with the different builds. So obviously I think with Tashigi, like I think the Dofi matchup I think is a little contentious, because I think a lot of Dofi players will tell you it's favored for them. A lot of Bonney players will tell you it's favored for them. I think the matchup was pretty 50-50, and depending on your build, slightly favored for Bonney and OP9. And I really honestly think the same thing in OP10. With stuff like Tashigi now, it just makes it even harder. Life is hard for Doflamingo against Bonnies in OP10. If you don't see Tashigi, if you don't have a strong start with a Carrot or Cavendish, or if you just don't see your 8-cost Kid, obviously, yeah, it can snowball and get out of hand. But I think it's overall slightly favored. For Teach, this is assuming you're not running Zoro, you're not running Straw Sword. It's going to be slightly unfavored, and just depending on your knowledge of the matchup, potentially even unfavored if it's a really good Teach player and they know how to play against you. And if you're just not seeing enough of your you know, like Smoker or Tashigi, if you don't see any Hodies, obviously it can be really hard. But just in general, I think if you're comfortable with the matchup as Bonney, I think it's only slightly unfavored. Shanks, this is assuming you're running at least like 3 9-cost Shanks. I think it's about 50-50, because with Smoker, 5-cost Smoker is a really good card against Shanks, especially if you're running something like Hawkins as well. Obviously this matchup kind of comes down to like who can draw their unsearchable cards better, where we're trying to get 9-cost Shanks and they're essentially trying to get 8-cost Rayleigh and Dragon sometimes too. 10-cost Shanks is really strong against Bonney, but it's, you know, it's easy enough to deal with as long as we have 9-cost Shanks. Stuff like Rayleigh destroys our mid-tempo, like our mid-game tempo and our board, which is really important and is what we need to kind of close out the game. So because of that, I think it's 50-50. When you're running just like a fortress build or something, as you can see, like, or just like highlighting Zoro instead of 9-cost Shanks, and maybe you don't have any 10-cost Dofis, because 10-cost Dofi is still a clutch card that can just give you the extra turn that you need. to like draw your Hody or get Dofi on the board first and then go for game with Hody. I think it's just a little bit more safe if you have 10 cost Dofi, and if you have the Shanks to back it up, I think it's 50-50. Usopp is, in my opinion, would be slightly favored if you're running the all-rounder approach, especially if you're running Hawkins. If you're not running Hawkins, I do think this matchup tends to be about 50-50. It really depends on the Usopp's build as well. If they're running 7 cost Luffy and Red Rock, and they draw into both of them, things can get kind of dicey. Usopp has a play on his 10 Don turn where he can play 4 cost Zoro to pop a blocker. Like if you have 8 cost Kid, if you don't have Tashigi on the board but you only have a blocker and Kid, they can play 4 cost Zoro to pop your blocker and then play Red Rock to bottom deck your Kid. And then if assuming they have, you know, like a Kiros or 2 on the board already, then they can kind of just go for game, and it can be kind of dicey. That being said, I do think 8 cost Kid is still really strong against Usopp. You just have to set up properly. And if you have something like Hawkins, if you steal first and play Hawkins on your 7 on turn and you have Hody to close out the game, you're sitting pretty. So yeah, in general, I think it's really close to being like a 50-50 matchup, but just if you have the all-rounder approach, I think it's slightly favored for Bonney. Smoker, unfavored. They can get around Tashigi. It's like, it helps, it really helps. And if they're not seeing the right cards they need at the right time early game, like if they don't hit a 1 cost Smoker Search or brand new, and they don't have Brook on 3 or 4 Dawn, then I think that immediately shifts the how the matchup goes. But I can't really base it off of that, because that's just like you just hoping that they low roll. So I don't want to really approach the matchup like that, like as just looking at it like this. So I'm going to say it's unfavored. Obviously, if you're running stuff like Hawkins and 8 cost Rosie and 10 cost Dofi, like you can see in the Donkey anti-KO build, I do think it's only slightly unfavored. And in the right hands, you could probably make this matchup a lot closer to 50-50, but it's really, really dependent on your build. And, you know, Bonney has ways to beat Black, but she's not able to really focus on that for her build for OP10. So, you know, that could change if Lucci and Smoker come up in the meta. You know, you'll just have to tech for it, right? Lucci, same thing, but even worse. Kind of. Smoker can be kind of more consistent in finding their like 5 cost Tashigis, but Lucci just has ways of dealing with your board and KOing everything even better. They're like, you really, if you don't see like multiple 10 cost Dofis, and if you don't have like a decent start, it's just unfavored, right? Like, I'm not going to try and lie. Lucci has the problem of being inconsistent and does struggle sometimes to find their pieces. And if you're really, really practiced in the matchup, I think you could sway things a little bit towards slightly unfavored, or even 50-50 in some cases, depending on your build. But I'm not going to leave too much up to assumption here, and I'm just going to go for like a very general kind of way of looking at it, and in my opinion it's going to be unfavored. Ploofy, I think with 8 cost Kid and 10 cost Dofi, you're just completely favored. Fortress, the Don Quixote build as well, but if you're not running 10 cost Dofi or Kid, if you're just running Zoro or something like that, you might have a little bit harder time. So that's why I said that one is maybe 50-50. BY I think is slightly favored, especially just with the general all-around build. Most of those are going to be like the Ploofy, BY. It's essentially, you know, like you're favored for the most part. It just depends on their skill level and each other's build. Red Green Smoker, I think in general slightly favored for Bonney, but depending on your build and their build, it can become 50-50 really quickly. They can make a more stable and more defensive 8 cost Kid faster than we can. And a lot of Red Green Smokers just ended up running 3 to 4 Hodis towards the end of OP10 over here in the East. And it weirdly starts to feel like a Bonney mirror. Luckily, it's different enough where it's not as psychological and you know, hard as a Bonney mirror. But yeah, in general, I think it's about slightly favored, but it really depends, and this can become 50-50. It's really similar to Usopp in my opinion, just depending on the build. Yellow Green Law, I think this is pretty favored for Bonney, especially if you're running more of a Fortress build. They just have a harder time kind of getting over Kid and getting around our defenses and being able to rest stuff. I have some friends who are some really good Yellow Green Law players, and I have lost to them for sure as using Bonney. and like it's not impossible. I think with a really good yellow-green law player, it's going to be a lot closer to 50-50 than you might think. But if you're running a very defensive fortress build, I just don't think there's any way to not say that it's going to be favored, or in the worst case scenario, slightly favored. Yellow Kid just has a hard time getting around ACOS Kid, ironically, and just being able to rest. And if you're running 3 to 4 Hodies, you just like create a lethal opportunity for yourself. If they're running stuff like ACOS Katakuri, which most people won't be, but when you go to a flagship and you hit the one guy in all of Tokyo that's running ACOS Katakuri in his Yellow Kid deck, you might be in for a world of trouble. So just watch out for techs and things like that. Some kids are going to be running Raigo, so if you don't have Tashigi or 2-cost Rosie to play down with your ACOS kid, you might be in a little bit of a pickle. But for the most part, it's hard for them to deal with what you can do with your deck, and it's going to be slightly favored. Boa, I'm sorry I had to write it like this, but I just felt like this was maybe the easiest way to do it. It's, if you have Tashigi, I think it's 50-50. If you don't, it's unfavored. It's really that simple, because like the second they can just take advantage of your board with something like a Grav Blade and then start red rocking away your top end, you're just going to lose. And unless you're playing like ACOS Rosie and Hawkins, I think you're really going to struggle, because one of the only ways we could kind of tackle Boa in the past was not give them the easy targets for the first couple of turns, swing at life, put down a Hawkins or two, and then hope we draw into something like multiple Zoro or 10-cost Dofis to like get red rocked but then have another one to play, or stun enough things with 10-cost Dofi to start going for game with Hody. Like Hody and Hawkins were kind of the key cards in that matchup, and this is kind of just assuming that not everyone's going to be running Hawkins, and assuming that just one like Hody in our top end is probably not going to be enough. But if you get a Tashigi down early, even if they're bouncing it back to your hand, it's so easy for us to eventually just start playing it out every turn with the other cards that we're playing, and eventually it's just going to stick. And it's just so strong. It's kind of insane how much one card can really turn the tides in a matchup, and I'm not trying to exaggerate, but it really is that much of a difference maker. Enel I thought I would just include because he's come up a little bit in EBO2, and I know in places like Australia and like over there he's pretty popular. So I would say the general build where you have Dofi, Shanks, Kid, and Hody, it's going to be slightly favored. They don't have 10-cost Enel yet, so it's hard for them to get the extra value when they start like doing Raigo plus healing and stuff like that. Fortress heavy build with no 10-cost Dofi I think is probably about 50-50, because that's how it's felt for me over here in EBO2. And then like the Don Quixote build and the miscellaneous with like Zoro and stuff, I think probably favored. Zoro's not really that strong against Enel if they have their Raigos online, but you know, if they're using all their Raigos on Zoro, then your other top end will eventually kind of like stick and start doing damage that way. So this is the chart. Obviously you can take your time and look over it. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. I am not the be all end all. I'm not the best Bonney player in the world, but this is like an aggregation of my own experiences mixed with what I've heard other people, other friends, other good Bonney players that I've talked to, and have kind of just made an amalgamation of the matchups here for you guys. And I hope it helps. Please take everything with a grain of salt, and a lot of these things are dependent on how good the player is and what their builds are, especially for matchups like Lucci or Shanks or Teach. I do think it really depends on how good you are as a Bonney player, and vice versa for your opponent. So yeah, same thing with kind of like Enel. But that's it for the matchup spread. Let's move on to the next session. All right, these are some winning deck list examples that I have for you guys. Let's take a look. This is a flagship winner. You can see their matchups on the side. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think the video is already kind of going on longer than it should. But you can see here, they ran one Bonney and one Hawkins, and in their comment they wrote like the 5-cost Bonney was really kind of like the star of the show for their flagship. And you can see they faced 2 Usops, and I guarantee you that Bonney and Hawkins, if they drew them, were probably very pivotal in those matchups. They're running 4 Kids and 4 Dofis with no Shanks. Luckily they didn't hit a red Shanks, but you know, Shanks dipped and came up and down a lot throughout the OP10 meta, so I think it's fair. And they're running 2 Smokers, so you're gonna see a lot of lists like probably start ending up looking like this. The 2-cost Luffy is just another body to play out against something like Teach as well. This was an unofficial tournament winner, the Gondyu Jima CS winner, and I thought this list was really interesting because I'll give you a second. See if you can notice what's missing from this list. It's Hody. There's no Hody in here, and I don't know if that's like if there's something going on here. I guess I didn't double check and make sure he has 50 cards, but I think that's all of them. There's no Hody, and he's running 4 beige instead. And beige is a really strong card in OP10. It's just so hard to find the space for him. You can see they're running 4 5-cost smokers and 4 beige. So like really interesting. 4 Shanks, 3 Dofi, 3 Kid, 2 Hawkins. I like it. I'm a fan. And then you'll notice the 12 2Ks. There's a lot of decks just running 12 2Ks in OP10 with 2 to 3 0 costs. So I wanted to highlight this one because not only did they go through a lot, they only lost to 1 Boa and then won the full event. They did it without Hody, which is crazy. And they played a Teach in the second round and in the first round of Top Cut, which is like kind of insane. I would love to see those matches. They probably drew Smoker each time, which is really strong, and then just kind of clutched it out with everything else. But this just shows you this dude's probably a really good player and knows what he's doing. So I wanted to showcase that list. This was a person who had 2 4-1 flagship runs, like right after one after the other, and I thought their list was interesting enough because they're running Luna, so I wanted to highlight it. 4 5-cost smokers. So you can see some people really double down on Smoker and then just run like less top end, which is safe. That's fair, because it's just hard if you run too much counterless. They ran 2 Lunas. And they had a pretty nice matchup spread. You can see they lost to an Enel on the first day and an Enel on the second day. So probably just, you know, wasn't their day, or, you know, things happen against Enel. Even if you're favored against him, stuff happens, right? I think we all know the feeling. But this was a really cool list, so I wanted to highlight that one too. There's no 9-cost Shanks too, which is really strong against Nell, so that might have been a little bit of a thing that hurt them in the end. And then the last one here is I got second place in an unofficial 3-on-3 with my team, and this was the list that I ran. I hit a Lucci round 1, and they ran 2-cost Uta, and then just high rolled me, and I couldn't do anything. So that was unfortunate. But then I had a really good run until we got to the top cut, and the Nell and the Dofi that I played in the Swiss, I ended up playing again, which was crazy. Enel, I made a small misplay mid game, and he just ended up outplaying me. And then for Dofi, I didn't find 8-cost Kid, and I had to go for game, and he didn't have exact counter. He had a little bit more, but it was close. It was a close game, but no Kid really hurt me, and I wasn't able to set up. And yeah, but I learned a lot in those games because they were against some good players. And yeah, I mean, I know it's not the best track record there. It would have been nice to win some of the games in Top Cut, but my team really pulled through, and it was a really fun event. And I learned a lot about like the kind of like deck building for OP10 and for 3-on-3s with this event too. And if I don't think I would really change anything. I would probably try and get a 4th Hody in there, honestly, if I could. But yeah, I think for that event too, yeah, 8-cost Kid was really clutch. 10-cost Dofi was strong as well. This is very similar to a list I took to my flagship EX that was a little bit before this, and so I was really enjoying it. I liked the 2 Hawkins. They came in extremely clutch against Enel and some of the other matchups as well. But yeah, this is just something to look at. I'm running 2 of the Ezos there, you can see too, just because I love Wano and I gotta rep my Wano baby. But yeah, this is just a list for me. I just wanted to give that a quick little shout out. All right, and as some like closing thoughts here and just a little bit of advice, I would say test out builds you like, tech for the meta, and adjust for your playstyle, because just grabbing a list that has 1 is not always going to mean that you're going to win. You really have to put in the time and effort to test out the matchups, know what you're doing in each matchup and what you like need to be playing around, and how to play to your outs and how to set up so that you can play to your outs. And I think something that's really important is like adjusting to your playstyle and figuring out what works best for you while still being optimized and strong into the meta. If you love 9-cost Zoro and you really want to run him, like just try it out, right? But then if it's not working, you're gonna have to cut him and like try something else. Like if you want to like be more competitive and win games and stuff, right? But if 9-cost Zoro works and you love 9-cost Zoro, then that's great. And then you're probably gonna be able to use that build better than other people might who like haven't been using him and don't know like the timing and stuff to play him down, right? That's gonna be it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. I know this one ended up being a little bit longer, but I hope it was a lot of useful information. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. You can catch me. I stream on Twitch 2 to 3 times a week over at Fudilio TCG, and we play a lot of Bonney. So come check it out over there. We've been playing EBO2 recently, but honestly, the meta's not much different for OP10, so I think it's still really helpful. And yeah, I just want to say I appreciate you guys a lot. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, because it helps me and it helps me make more stuff like this. And that's it. So I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.